Good morning, King's College. Good morning, London. Good afternoon, Manila. And a good day to all our viewers. Thank you to the Department of War Studies and Women in War and International Politics, and to the Department of History for inviting me here today to this webinar. It is through the efforts of Sarah Miller and Robin Ferguson that I am with you today to share with you my research and paper on the women of the Philippine Resistance. I'd like to thank you both dearly for giving me this opportunity to impart to our viewers our Philippine World War II history. And so, with this, I would like to start my presentation. Historians have estimated that 1 in every 10 Filipino guerrillas during World War II was female. They came from all social classes and backgrounds and served the gamut of roles as nurses and medics, field commanders, soldiers, spies, saboteurs, recruiters, and propagandists. Like their male counterparts, these Filipino resistance fighters took on their share of the ordeals of war, enduring starvation and malaria in the jungles and mountains, risking life and limb for the love of country. But for all their courage, wit, and resourcefulness, women's role in the resistance gets far less attention than it should get. Except for a few memoirs written by women, there is a lack of literature available on the vital role women played during the war. There is a need to fill this void and reinforce the importance of women's substantial participation in resistance activities that helped in the overall war effort. But before we proceed to our subject proper, allow me to give you a brief history of the Philippines to put everything in perspective. When Ferdinand Magellan landed on our shores in 1521, he named it the Philippines after King Philip and claimed the islands for Spain. This was during his famous voyage to circumnavigate the globe. Only he wasn't able to do so, for when he started demanding for tributes from the locals, he was killed by Lapu-Lapu, ruler of Mactan, the first Filipino to rise up against a foreign invader. However, despite the initial show of force and courage of the Filipinos, which sent the Spaniards packing, they returned some 40 years later and colonized the islands for the next 3.5 centuries, with a brief intermission of 2 years when the British took over in 1762. But with the help of loyal Filipinos, Spain was able to retake the Philippines in 1764. After 333 years and hundreds of revolts, the Filipinos finally won its independence from Spain during the 1898 Philippine Revolution. It can be recalled that the Spanish-American War was also brewing during this period, and as a result of American victory, Spain ceded the Philippines to America in the amount of $20 million in the Treaty of Paris. This enraged the Filipinos, who were not even allowed to participate in the treaty. This resulted in the Philippine-American War, which lasted from 1899 until 1902, with the capture of our president, Emilio Aguinaldo. American rule in its early years was opposed, but with many good changes introduced, like improved education, health and sanitation, and a roadmap to self-governance, the Filipinos had a change of heart. True to America's promise, the nation became a commonwealth in 1935, with independence to be granted 10 years after, in 1945. This era was known to be one of the best periods in our history, a seemingly magical time called peacetime. Manila, with its tree-lined boulevards and the blend of old Spanish architecture and neoclassical government buildings, was dubbed as the Pearl of the Orient and was oftentimes described as the most beautiful city in Asia. But this prosperous period was rudely interrupted by the Second World War. On December 8, 1941, or December 7 U.S. time, the Philippines was attacked by Japan just a few hours after Pearl Harbor. It was supposed to be a simultaneous bombing event of U.S. military installations in the Pacific, but the Japanese bombers headed for the Philippines was delayed by thick fog. After several weeks of aerial bombardment, the Japanese troops finally landed on Philippine shores on the 22nd of December, 1941, tens of thousands strong. Based on the U.S. military's War Plan Orange, the Filipino-American USAFE troops were ordered to take their position in Bataan to deny the Japanese the use of Manila Bay. They fought a good fight, but with the Europe First policy, the promised men and material never came. After 5 long months of fighting, with no reinforcements and no more food nor weapons, the sick, malnourished, and starving Filipino and American troops surrendered in Bataan on April 9, 1942. The over 70,000 surrendered forces were made to walk the 105-mile infamous Bataan Death March under the grueling heat of the tropical sun. The march took days, and thousands died due to brutal Japanese treatment ranging from beatings to bayonettings and beheadings. The Filipino civilians who tried to help the prisoners by giving food and water were not spared either. They too suffered bayoneting and death once caught by the Japanese. One pregnant lady who was caught handing papayas to the marching troops was beaten, her belly slit open, and the fetus gouged out by a bayonet from her stomach. She died on the spot that horrible day. The march ended in Camp O'Donnell, a Philippine army base that the Japanese commandeered. With overcrowding, no food and medicine, thousands more died in the camp. The average daily death rate in the camp was at 500. The Japanese also commandeered the University of Santo Tomas campus in the heart of Manila, the University of the Philippines campus in Los Baños, Laguna, and the Old Bilibid prison. These were converted into internment camps for all Allied civilians and housed Americans, British, Canadians, Dutch, and French nationals. Manila was such a cosmopolitan city before the war that many foreign nationals were doing business and residing here. They were interred by the Japanese at these camps in miserable conditions until the end of the war. And this was how the Japanese began their 3.5-year reign of terror, characterized by brutal treatment and savage atrocities. They exercised authoritarian rule and used brute force to subjugate the population. Severe punishments were meted out for minor offenses, and humiliating slaps greeted those who did not bow low enough to the Japanese guards. Civil liberties were removed and personal freedoms lost, and anyone suspected of anti-Japanese sentiments were tortured and killed. These cruel treatment, coupled with many incidences of rape, looting, and plunder, spurred the formation of the resistance. Many women with access to grind joined the resistance to seek retribution for loved ones killed or persecuted by the enemy. No other occupied people in Southeast Asia fought harder and resisted more stubbornly than the Filipinos. Often also overlooked is the fact that no other occupied country in Southeast Asia had more women involved in the resistance than in the Philippines. Estimates say that there were around 25,000 Filipino women involved in the resistance. There were possibly more, but due to their status as female and the non-combatant roles many played, countless more were not officially recognized. This paper examines the wartime exploits of some of these intrepid women, ranging from soliciting aid to clandestine underground work to saving downed pilots, breaking gender stereotypes, and proving their mettle. By early 1942, after the fall of Bataan, many guerrilla groups had sprouted all over the country. Women also heeded the call to defend their country from the invading Imperial Japanese forces. The rise and success of these guerrilla groups, in part, is attributable to the women in the group who served vital roles as nurses, organizers, intelligence, and commanders in the battlefield. In this section, I will discuss with you some important and major guerrilla groups and the women who helped run these groups. Smart, feisty, and headstrong, half American, half Filipina Yai Panlilio became a reporter for the Philippines Herald and a broadcaster for KZRH. Yai was the finest and most famous female reporter before the war. During the occupation, the Japanese seized KZRH, and Yai was made to do the news broadcasts in English. In between Japanese-censored news broadcasts, Yai subtly inserted messages, clues, and innuendos, giving key information to the Philippine-American troops fighting in Bataan, and warned the people of things to come. The Japanese soon found out and ordered her arrest. With the help of friends, she went into hiding in a farm east of Manila, where she met the guerrillas of Marking, headed by Marcos Marking Agustin. Marking's guerrillas grew to 20,000 strong by 1944 and is one of the major guerrilla groups in the country. She joined the group and became Marking's right hand, advising him on many important matters. Fondly called Mammy by the boys, she ran the camp and nursed the sick and the wounded. She handled documentation and paperwork, made reports and propaganda materials, and wrote letters to rich, influential friends in Manila for support. In a tribute by the guerrillas of Marking after the war, they wrote, "To Mami Yai, always first in our hearts. Your memory will never fade, for you are right here in our hearts, carved for all eternity. During our 3-year sojourn in the rugged Sierra Madre Mountains, you have been our guiding light. You comforted and consoled us when we were low, you advised us when you found it necessary, and you bawled us out when we did wrong." In 1950, she wrote her autobiography, The Crucible, which recounts her life as a guerrilla in the rugged mountain fastness of the Sierra Madres. The book, for one, is a landmark in literary history, for it was the first Filipino-authored book published by a big U.S. publisher. In the book, Yai emphasizes her biracial traits, her American upbringing being the source of her principles of democracy and fairness, and her belief that women are equal to men, and her Filipino blood as the source of her passion and devotion to the cause. She wrote, "Filipinos will die for love, and Americans will die for principle. I am half and half. I die the same way." Most importantly, she wrote the book to publicize the important and unrecognized contributions of the Filipino guerrillas and to recognize the role of the women in the resistance. After the war, Yai and Marking were married and spent much of the post-war years working for the recognition of Filipino guerrillas. In 1950, this iconic female guerrilla received her Medal of Freedom from the U.S. government for her outstanding work during the war. In 1943, 16-year-old Sofia Gatil Tidon was recruited into the PQOG, or President Quezon's own guerrillas, given the rank of Private First Class and assigned to the 25th Red Lions Combat Division based in Los Baños, Laguna. She did surveillance, propaganda, and recruitment work for the unit and tended to her wounded and sick comrades. During daytime, she helped her mother tend their small store in the market where her mother sold native rice cakes and other native snacks. Their store became an important rendezvous point and message center for the guerrillas. Sofia and her colleagues also smuggled in food to the Allied internees at the Los Baños internment camp, which was ran by the notorious Japanese camp officer Sadaaki Konishi. But one day, Sofia got caught. She was subjected to the water torture and beaten by the Japanese. To this day, 95-year-old Tidon feels her chest tighten and her heart pound whenever she remembers that harrowing torture inflicted on her. In October 1944, the PQOG guerrillas rescued a downed American pilot by the name of Lieutenant William Foy. Sofia took care of Foy, who was badly wounded with a broken neck and damaged spine. Now known to have survived the crash, the Japanese hunted for Foy, and the guerrillas had to hide him from one place to another. People suspected of harboring the American were arrested, tortured, and executed. In February 1945, the Japanese escalated their patrols and mercilessly slaughtered many residents in Sofia's town. Among those killed were Sofia's mother and 3 younger siblings. On February 23, 1945, the combined efforts of the American troops and Filipino guerrillas led to the daring rescue of more than 2,000 Allied internees in Los Baños. The jubilation of the successful rescue was short-lived, for the Japanese, led by Konishi, came back and took out their wrath on the Filipino population. An estimated 1,500 innocent, helpless Filipinos were cruelly massacred in reprisal for the successful rescue of the Allied internees. It is almost impossible to imagine how a young girl of 16, tortured by the enemy and whose family and townmates had been massacred by the enemy, was able to move on. Sofia herself said, "I am stronger than my misfortunes." In 2018, she was awarded the U.S. Congressional Gold Medal, and with her in the photo is Richard Foy, son of Lieutenant William Foy, who Sofia rescued and took care of in 1945. Richard wrote the book Foy and the Filipinos, which details the heroism, courage, loyalty, and kindness of the Filipinos. Richard emphasized in his book that the Filipinos performed these acts of kindness and humanity despite great risks to their lives. One of the strongest guerrilla groups ever formed was the Hukbalahap, or Huk, made up of a strong socialist peasant base. And one of the highest-ranking female Huks was Remedios Gomez of Mexico, Pampanga. Her father, Basilio Gomez, was the town mayor. When the Japanese were marching to their town, he ordered the townsfolk to gather their arms and resist the Japanese. However, they were defeated, and her father was publicly executed as a warning to the others if they did not cooperate. As punishment, his remains were not given back to the family. With the score to settle, she joined the Hooks. She was baptized Commander Liwayway and was trained in jungle warfare. Guerrilla tactics can be learned, Liwayway said, but only perfected through actual encounters. She became known as the lipstick-wielding commander, for before going to battles, she put on makeup and polished her nails. She said these gave her men confidence to be fighting under a commander who was fearless yet calm. She didn't tolerate sexual harassment and challenged her male comrade to a duel, as she was so sick and tired of his sexual innuendos and advances. She passed away in 2014 at the age of 95. But before she died, she said these important words. Filipino women played an important role during the war. Like their male counterparts, they held important positions and dedicated their lives to driving away the Japanese invaders. I hope that someday the role of these unsung heroines will find a place in history. Our next hero had a very different kind of contribution to the war effort. In the 1930s, Maria Orosa was the head of the Food Preservation Division of the Bureau of Science. Her goal was to make the Philippines self-sufficient and not reliant on imported food products. She experimented on local foods and came up with 700 recipes. Many of her inventions are being sold commercially today, like fruit preserves, local fruit juice concentrates, banana chips, candied fruits, and vitamin-enriched snacks. Most importantly, during the pre-war years, her team went all over the country to teach home gardening, food preservation, and canning methods, which was put to good use during the war years. She joined Marking's guerrillas as an underground agent, and through the guerrilla network, 2 of her inventions were smuggled into the internment camps. These were Soya Lac, a protein-rich soybean product, and the rock cookies made of rice and high in vitamin B complex to fight beriberi. These magic foods saved thousands of lives in the POW and Allied internment camps. At the height of the Battle of Manila in February 1945, she was hit by shrapnel and was immediately rushed to the Remedios Hospital in Malate. Sadly, the hospital was also bombed, and this time a fatal shrapnel hit her right in her heart. This next section is a tribute to the Filipino resistance in the world of show business. During the golden age of Philippine cinema in the 1930s and 1940s, no other movie star reigned more supreme than Carmen Rosales, the queen of Philippine cinema. Born Januaria Constantino Keller, she adopted the screen name Carmen Rosales, starting her career as a radio voice talent. She married prominent radio personality Ramon Novales. On December 1941, as the Japanese marched to Manila, the movie emblazoned on theater marquees was Lolita, a Carmen Rosales movie. During the Japanese occupation, Carmen's husband Ramon, involved in some underground activities, died tragically in the hands of the Japanese. After Ramon's death, Carmen continued Ramon's fight. She joined the guerrilla group of Huk Balahap. For a few years, Carmen went to the hills, shed her career as an actress, and toted a .45 caliber gun around the countryside south of Manila. A sharpshooter, she disguised herself as a man and put on a fake mustache when they would go on missions. In one of these missions, Carmen killed a well-known Japanese collaborator in that area. She was forced to flee to the next province to evade Japanese capture, but eventually she was found and arrested. As punishment, she was forced by the Japanese to star in a Japanese propaganda film, Tres Marias. She had no choice but to agree when the Japanese threatened to kill the residents of her hometown. After the war, her townmates honored her for saving them by naming their town Carmen. After the war, she starred in 2 war movies, Guerrillera and Kaaway ng Bayan, or The Enemy of the Nation. Guerrillera's storyline was based partly on her wartime exploits. These 2 post-war movies propelled her to such fame that she became the highest-paid movie actress of her time. Vaudeville, the localized form of the vaudeville, was introduced in the Philippines in the early 1900s. It was a popular genre of entertainment which featured a hodgepodge of musical and dance numbers, short comedy and drama skits, and even magic acts and acrobatics. Vaudeville gained its peak popularity during the war years 1941 to 1945, when the Japanese ordered all film productions to cease in the hopes of removing Western influences through movies. The vaudeville then became the only source of entertainment for the masses. Many of the cinemas and movie theaters in Manila became the venue for these vaudeville presentations. The vaudeville reflected the pulse of the public, and hence, during this period, vaudeville shows would include anti-Japanese messages in a very Filipino way, through comedy. Vaudeville became the venue for poking fun at the enemy, the way TV shows of today have comedians making parodies of politicians. But it was not all comedy, for when the Japanese got wind of comedic duo Pugo and Togo parodying a Japanese officer wearing many wristwatches, they were picked up and briefly incarcerated. Togo himself thought of his screen name as parody to the equally bald Japanese General Hideki Tojo. There was also another comedy skit entitled The Return of Arturo that alluded to the famous I shall return promise of General Douglas MacArthur. Some cast members worked in the underground, and some guerrillas came to watch the shows. When word reached the performers that the dreaded Japanese military police are coming, they would break into a special song and dance number that served as code to the guerrillas to leave the theater. This next group of women are remarkable for soliciting aid, bringing food and supplies to guerrillas and internment camps, and thus helped save the lives of many. But the other side to this aid giving is their dangerous underground work of gathering intel, smuggling letters and messages, quinine, and other contrabands, which, when found out, will surely mean death. This takes courage, and these women have it. The Miss U Spy Network, named after Margaret Utinsky, who organized the group, was one of the most important and successful underground communication and supply system established between POW camps and friends of relatives of the prisoners in Manila. To avoid internment, she changed her identity to Rosena Utinsky, a Lithuanian, as Lithuania was a neutral country then. One of the most important persons in this group was 22-year-old Filipina Naomi Flores, codenamed Luther. To purchase supplies for the POWs, Flores and Utinsky started to raise funds by selling their own possessions like jewelry and furniture. Pretty soon, donations poured in from rich and influential people in Manila. Claire Phillips, also known as High Pockets, used this network to send money and supplies from the earnings of her nightclub, Club Chubaki, which catered to Japanese high officials. The almost impossible task of smuggling in supplies and money into the Cabanatuan POW camps fell to Dr. Romeo Atienza of the Philippine Red Cross. Dr. Atienza took great risks in bringing Naomi into the camp, where she was able to make contact with Colonel Mack, and they both devised a plan to bring in supplies to the camp in Cabanatuan. She commuted every week to the camp, dressed in peasant garb, and pretended to sell vegetables. She hid her packages containing letters, money, and other supplies under a bridge, where a member of a prisoner's grass-cutting detail would come to get them. These were then brought into the camp, hidden in their pushcarts. Aside from her clandestine supply work, Naomi also hid 3 escaped Americans in her house. One of these Americans was careless and got involved with a Spanish mestiza who was living with a Japanese captain and was a spy herself. Naomi was arrested, tied up, and kept in a dark room at Fort Santiago, which became a torture center run by the dreaded Japanese military police, the Kempeitai. She was beaten, her legs burned with hot iron, and was made to kneel for hours on the edge of a sharpened strip of bamboo. She would be arrested 2 more times and narrowly escaped death when the Japanese was hot on her trail after they caught the prisoner work details with her packages. All her connections in Cabanatuan, who were helping her in her network, were arrested and given the water torture. Amazingly, they all swore ignorance and no one gave out information. When things got too dangerous, Naomi hid in the mountains under the protection of the Hukbalahap. Not for long, members of the Miss U network were arrested, tortured, and many were executed. Claire Phillips was tortured and sentenced to hard labor. In 1948, Naomi Flores was awarded the Medal of Freedom for her invaluable contribution to aid the POWs. She later married American Army officer John Francis Jackson, who was assigned in Manila to investigate war crimes. Lourdes Lulu Reyes. Lulu Reyes' life was radically changed that fateful day of April 9, 1942. Hearing news of Bataan's surrender, her mother fell to the ground and wept for her son, Willie, who was fighting in Bataan. Lulu promised her widowed mother that she will find her brother, and as the president of the Chaplains Aid Association, she assisted priests who said Mass and gave communion at the concentration camp. This way, she was able to find her brother. But finding her brother wasn't enough for this lady with a big heart. Father Forbes Moynihan, an Irish Jesuit, wrote in his book Under the Red Sun, "After the fall of Bataan, Lulu went to Tarlac with her mother to bring help to her brother Willie, who was a prisoner. Seeing the misery of other POWs, she devoted herself to aiding them. Though it was forbidden to enter the prison camp, Lulu went to the Japanese commandant and got his permission to bring in medicines and food. She smuggled money and notes, even if she was warned death was the penalty for doing so." At the end of the war, Lulu Reyes was awarded the U.S. Medal of Freedom for her heroic efforts to aid American POWs. But her heroism did not end with the war. On Christmas 1945, Lulu Reyes was walking along Escolta, Manila's commercial district, when she saw a tired-looking woman with many children. The kind heart that she was, she took out her money and gave it to the widow. Lulu never shared this story publicly and was surprised years later when Manila Times editor Max Sullivan wrote a column which said the best Christmas they ever had was because of the generosity of a woman named Lulu Reyes. The woman she gave the money to was Max Sullivan's mother, Pelagia. After the war, Lulu got married, raised a family, and continued with her religious and charitable works, earning her the Papal Award in 1981 for her admirable service to her fellow men. While the infamous Bataan Death March was still halfway to its destination, Josefa Llanes Escoda, her husband Tony, and a group of doctors went to San Fernando to give medical aid to the captured Filipino and American troops. Hiding from the Japanese guards, she secretly took down names, addresses, and messages from the POWs. Upon the return to Manila, she mobilized the members of the National Federation of Women's Clubs, of which she was the president, and set them off to bring messages to the families of the soldiers. On seeing the horrors of the march, Tony and Josefa tapped on different groups and people to solicit aid for the POWs. Josefa was well known as she was a leading civic and social figure of her time and was active in many charitable and social work. She founded the Girl Scouts of the Philippines and was one of the main figures in the Philippines suffrage movement. They tapped on the different women's and civic groups, and almost immediately a group was organized, the Volunteers Social Aid Committee, or VSAC. The group brought food, supplies, and clothing to the POW camps and did much underground work. To raise funds, they organized several benefit shows at the Metropolitan Theater, unbeknownst to the Japanese officers attending these shows. The VSAC ladies were able to convince the Japanese officials for them to do their humanitarian work by softening the officials with fried chicken dinners and deceitful smiles. The girls were even able to convince the Japanese to let them open a commissary shop and sell goods to the prisoners, which, of course, was a front for them to continue their underground work of sending letters and money to the prisoners. By early 1944, word reached the Escodas that they were being watched by Japanese spies. Perhaps sensing her imminent death, she wrote an ominous letter to her cousin, Lieutenant Llanes, in early 1944. "I have done my duty to my country and God. To my mind, the best I have done is having helped with the little I could to save the lives of the surrendered soldiers of Bataan and Corregidor. I have offered myself as a guarantor for men, later released by the enemy, that they commit no anti-Japanese act, men who, if they had the guts left, would continue their resistance. I have acted as guarantor not only for the sake of humanity, but also to encourage them to fight again. If we happen to survive and I fail, tell our people that the women of the Philippines did their part in making the ember sparks of truth and liberty alive until the last moment." Tony Escoda was captured in June 1944. Then the Japanese came for Josefa 2 months later. Her children remembered the day she was arrested. Standing just a little over 4 feet tall, she was flanked by several armed Japanese and taken away. The humanitarian that she was, her daughter Teresita remembered her mother's words. "If the roles were reversed and if it were the Japanese who were prisoners of war, I would have done the same." She was last seen, beaten and weak, sometime late January 1945. Together with other resistance fighters, she was brought to the North Cemetery, where she was executed. After the war, POWs and internees whom the Escodas have helped started the Escoda Fund, which provided for the education of their 2 children in the United States. Josefa Llanes Escoda's whole life has been one of devoted service to others. She was brave until the end, and her beautiful, courageous spirit will always be an inspiration for all Filipinos. In 1991, the Central Bank of the Philippines launched the 1,000 peso bill, which featured 3 prominent World War II heroes of the country. Josefa Llanes Escoda represented the women's sector, Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos represented the civil government, and General Vicente Lim represented the armed forces. It was a fitting tribute to these 3 great heroes who resisted the enemy and gave up their lives for the nation. In any war, intelligence is the key to bringing about swift victory. Here are the stories of 3 intrepid Filipino women who acted as couriers, spies, and saboteurs. Against overwhelming odds, they fulfilled their dangerous mission right under the enemy's noses, making an American officer exclaim, "My God, I never dreamed that Filipino women had such courage." Josefina Joey Guerrero was a happy young mother in the 1930s, married to Dr. Renato Maria Guerrero, scion of one of the most distinguished clans in Manila. She lived a nice and comfortable life, blissfully unaware of things to come. First came the headaches, and then the extreme fatigue. Then her appetite waned, and soon suspicious skin lesions appeared. Her diagnosis came: she had leprosy. For a while, she was able to keep the lesions at bay, but once the Japanese occupation began, her access to medicine was cut off. Rather than sulk, she decided to do something worthwhile with her life. She made contact with the guerrillas and became a courier, hiding messages in her hair or inside her socks. Upon seeing her lesions, the Japanese would back away and would hurriedly let her go. In a way, her affliction became her passport, and it became her best weapon. As the Americans were returning, Joey was tasked to draw maps of Japanese fortifications, minefields, and gun emplacements. She pretended to take strolls, but was memorizing the landscape, jotting down areas where there were freshly dug earth, indicative of a landmine newly placed by the enemy. In early January 1945, she was told to deliver these maps to the American forces in Kalumpit, Bulacan. Despite extreme body ache and fatigue, she trudged the 40-kilometer route and reached the American camp, only to be told that the Americans had moved to the next town. Too weak to walk, she hired a bangka or a native canoe, carefully avoiding an ongoing battle between the Hooks and the Japanese in the area. Upon reaching the American headquarters, she gave the map to Captain Blair of the 37th Infantry Division. Knowing the great distance and the extreme risk Joey went through, Captain Blair exclaimed, "My God, I never dreamed that Filipino women had such courage." Because of her map, Joey saved thousands of American soldiers who would have walked right to their death. She was awarded the Medal of Freedom with silver palm, honoring foreign civilians who had done something courageous to save American lives. After the war, friends petitioned so she could be brought to Carville Leprosarium in the U.S. for treatment, the very first foreigner to be given this privilege. She was pronounced leprosy-free in 1957. In the 1970s, she moved to Washington, D.C. When she died, none of her friends knew of her past or of her family in the Philippines. Only when her obituary ran in a Washington newspaper did an old friend from 50 years ago surface to tell the world of her heroic past. Florence Ebersole Smith. Florence Ebersole was born to a Filipino mother and American father. Her father, Charles, was a veteran of the Philippine-American War who opted to reside here in the Philippines. Before the war, Florence worked as a stenographer for the U.S. Army in Fort Santiago under Lieutenant Colonel Englehart. She then met Navy man Charles Smithy Smith, and they got married in August 1941. He was killed in action on February 8, 1942, during a mission to resupply troops in Bataan. During the occupation, she worked for the Japanese-controlled Philippine Liquid Fuel Distributing Union, and because of her impeccable handwriting, she was assigned to write and log fuel vouchers. She diverted precious fuel supplies to the guerrillas and helped sabotage shipments to the Japanese. She also helped smuggle in food, medicine, and other supplies to the POW camps. She was arrested, interrogated, and tortured for months. Her interrogators, led by a Japanese who spoke good English, electrocuted her and confined her in a 2 feet by 4 feet box for days whenever they didn't like her answers. Fed only 1 bowl of rice porridge per day, her weight dropped to a mere 80 pounds. When the Americans liberated Manila, she joined the U.S. Coast Guards to avenge her husband's death. She was discharged after the war, married Army veteran Robert Finch, and raised a family. In November 1947, recommended by her former boss, Lieutenant Colonel Engelhardt, she was awarded the Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award given by the U.S. government. In 1995, the Coast Guard honored her by naming a building for her at Coast Guard Base in Honolulu. A book about the life of this courageous woman was launched this year. Magdalena Leones was a preacher's daughter and a deaconess of their evangelical church. She joined her American missionary friends who were members of the Phil-American Irregular Troops, or FAIT. They were helped by Lieutenant Colonel Reyes, who had arrived from Australia via submarine and who was tasked by General MacArthur to coordinate guerrilla activities. Leones was ordered by Lieutenant Colonel Reyes to get the roster of the guerrillas of northern Luzon. The guerrillas got suspicious and took her in for questioning. She was interrogated by Colonel Russell Volkman, commander of the northern Luzon guerrillas, and found out that she was working with the American missionaries, 2 of whom had saved his life earlier. Volkman sent an agent to Manila to verify her story. On the agent's return, he reported that the missionary group was tortured and beheaded by the enemy, betrayed by the sly, sweet-talking Lieutenant Colonel Reyes, who in real life was Franco Vera Reyes, a spy for the Japanese. Magdalena was beside herself in grief when she found out the fate of her friends, and this made her resolve stronger. Impressed by her earlier work in obtaining the roster, Volkman made her an intelligence agent. She was able to penetrate enemy-held territories to bring much-needed supplies and gather information. She took note of enemy installations and positions, listed down Japanese ships docked in La Union, and noted troop movement. One of her more important missions was to collect vital radio parts that the guerrillas needed so they could broadcast to General MacArthur in Australia. In October 1945, upon the recommendation of Volkman, she received the Silver Star Medal, the 3rd highest military decoration of the United States. To date, she is the only Asian woman awarded with the Silver Star Medal. Like many other resistance fighters, she went back to her quiet life, got married, and raised a family. In 1969, she migrated to the U.S. and passed away in 2016 at the age of 96. In keeping with her final wish, her remains were brought home to the Philippines and she was laid to rest in her most rightful place at the National Heroes Cemetery. The month-long battle for the liberation of Manila happened in February of 1945. An estimated 100,000 innocent civilians were slaughtered by the Japanese in the most unimaginable ways. The Japanese troops were ready to fight to the death and intended to bring as many with them to the grave. It was the worst urban warfare in the Pacific, and Manila became the most devastated city in the Pacific, where almost 700 city blocks were bombed, shelled, or razed to the ground by maniacal Japanese Marines. Reading about the heroic and selfless acts of some of the women of the streets or prostitutes during the Battle of Manila, I felt the need to include them here. I feel that their stories have taken too long to tell, and people need to know about the great deeds of humanity perpetuated by this marginal group of women. At the height of the Battle of Manila on February 9, 1945, the residents of Ermita and Malate, a posh section of Manila, were herded by the Japanese to Plaza Ferguson, and the men were separated from the women and children. The women were brought to the Bayview Hotel. Soon, the evil intentions of the lust-crazed Japanese became evident. Extreme fear, panic, and chaos ensued as the Japanese began searching for young virgins to rape. To protect the young girls and teenagers from being raped, the older women placed the young women to the back of the room while they stayed near the entrances or doors. A group of white Russian prostitutes called attention to and offered themselves so that the Japanese would spare the young girls. Though many were still victimized, many were saved by the selfless acts of these Russian prostitutes. Meanwhile, in Intramuros, the ancient Spanish city right in the heart of Manila, Dr. Antonio Hisbert, who was tending to the sick, the wounded, and the dying, had only praise and high regard for the prostitutes of Intramuros. They saved many young girls from being raped by offering themselves instead. They also went out and helped bury the dead, which littered the streets of Manila. When Dr. Hisbert needed bandages, these women would go to the Japanese and be back later, bandages on hand. When he asked for alcohol, which he needed as disinfectant and to ease the agonies of the dying, they went out to get these for him, and soon they came back with several bottles of gin. In many of his talks after the war, Dr. Hisbert always called these women as heroines. When Filipino nurses volunteered for Bataan, they were considered civilians and did not have any ranks. Under the jungle canopy, somewhere near the tip of the Bataan Peninsula, 3 makeshift hospitals were built: General Hospitals Number 1 and 2 and the Philippine Army General Hospital. The first 2 were mostly run by American personnel and the latter entirely by Philippine medical personnel. All 3 hospitals were overflowing with the sick, the wounded, and the dying. Starving and overworked, the medical staff had to also contend with working under constant strafing by the Japanese. Although they were clearly marked with the Red Cross, the hospitals were deliberately bombed by the enemy. The night before Bataan fell, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps was ordered to evacuate to Corregidor. At first, the order only applied to the American nurses. Their volunteer Filipino colleagues were ordered to stay behind. However, Second Lieutenant Josephine Nesbitt, the head of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, dug in her heels and said, "If my Filipino nurses don't go, I'm not going either." Her superiors conceded, and all of the nurses, civilian and military, Filipino and American, departed for Corregidor. After the war, Captain Josie Nesbitt wrote to the U.S. Army recommending that their 30 Filipino colleagues be awarded some recognition. An excerpt from her letter reads, "They are heroines, and I feel they are very deserving of any consideration we can get for them. They were loyal as they could be to us while we were interned in Santo Tomas, and as soon as they could come into camp after our release, they were right there to rejoice with us. They suffered a great deal during those long years of war and are still having many hardships to endure. If we can give them a little public praise and a medal of some kind, I'm sure we will never regret it." Meanwhile, all over the country, nurses volunteered, many attached to guerrilla units. When the troops moved, the nurses moved with them, climbing mountains and hiking for days while taking care of their patients. Sometimes the nurses were stationed less than 2 kilometers from the battle to be at hand for any emergency. Remarkably, these nurses served without any thought of financial reward nor professional recognition. Many more served in far-flung areas of our country, but due to the non-combatant nature of their services, their stories remain untold. They took great risks and carried on as gallantly as their brothers in arms, armed only with their Nightingale pledge to practice their profession faithfully and to dedicate their lives in devoted service to human welfare. Filipina social scientist Mina Roses summed it up best when she wrote, "The true Filipina, as our history reveals to us, was one who was full of self-sacrifice, devotion, and loyalty. But at the same time, she had common sense and had a head to rule her heart. She was brave enough to go out with her menfolk and stay by their side until the last ditch. She did not mope at home, burning candles before her favorite saint, while her home, her children, and her country were in peril." Never did these words ring more true than during the dark days of World War II. This period stood witness to the great strides the Filipina had accomplished, breaking gender stereotypes and proving her mettle. But while honors and accolades have been reaped on the men, the women's great feats of valor seem to have been forgotten in time. Despite their huge contributions to the war effort, women remain marginalized in World War II history narratives, and so much work needs to be done in this area. 75 years after the dust of war has settled, the world's collective war memory seems to be fading. Let us not make their memories fade, for these women's stories deserve to be remembered and honored by generations to come. And with that, I end my talk. I hope that I was able to share with you the lives of these amazing women of World War II. It has been both an honor and a pleasure to speak to the faculty and students of King's College London. Thank you very much, Robin and Sarah, for inviting me here today. And thank you to the Department of War Studies and Women in War and International Politics. I wish you all a great and productive day ahead.